All right. So tonight we're basically going to finish off the life of David with the lesson 21-22, the United Monarchy. The PowerPoint is, you'll know when we get to the second lesson because the PowerPoint changes to a darker background. For those of you that are actually watching online, I'd be curious to hear if it's easier to see because I forgot about switching to the darker background when I first started. And last time I taught this class halfway through, I was getting feedback from people online. It's hard to read the slides. So we switched to the dark background. But you'd be curious with you guys in the classroom if you guys think it's easier to read as well. But if you wonder why, once I realized that it changed and then I realized all the rest of the slides are that way, I just figured we're just going to have a change in the middle of our lesson and go with it. And then from here on out, you're going to get the dark slides. So tonight, we're looking at David's life once he is king. Prior to this, we were talking about David under Saul. And we ended last time with basically Saul and his sons being killed on Mount Gilboa. To give you guys where that's at in Scripture, that's pretty much the end of 1 Samuel, and we're now going into the beginning of 2 Samuel. The book of Chronicles is a parallel to some of the last parts of 1 Samuel, but is pretty much a parallel of 2 Samuel, and then when you get to Kings, it parallels the Kings. So Chronicles starts about right now in the story, and it has different things included in it. For instance, the sin with Bathsheba is not included in Chronicles, whereas if I remember correctly, the sin of counting the men is not included in Samuel. And so you have the two there. I didn't know until later on in life that the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles were parallel to 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. In other words, they have a lot of the same content, some of it identical. So just like in the Gospels, when you do a parallel study and you compare the different accounts, it's wise to do that with the 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings with Chronicles. The reason why is that if you're ever teaching a lesson and you're going through, you might get to something where it's unclear in the one book, but you guess where it might be, and you come up with this great significant point to it, only to later read in Chronicles that actually, no, it was this, and you were completely wrong, and you made a point out of nothing. So that's why you want to make sure if you're studying in one of these books to study the parallel passage in the other book, especially if you're teaching. So David then, when Saul and his sons are killed on Mount Gilboa, if you'll remember, David was in Ziklag. That's where he was living at the time. He was an ally of the Philistines. In fact, he had showed up to go to the same battle that Saul was killed in. And he was rejected by the other Philistine leaders, probably wisely so, because he, yes, would have turned on the Philistines and would never have fought against Saul. But when he goes back to Ziklag, if you'll remember, the Amalekites had come and attacked Ziklag, taken all of them captive, and David had to go and rescue them. So when David gets back to Ziklag, within days of having rescued all of them from the Amalekites, who should show up to him but an Amalekite with Saul's armband and Saul's crown, saying that he had killed Saul. Now we know from the end of 1 Samuel that the Amalekite did not kill Saul. Saul instead saw that he lost the battle and turned to his armor bearer and asked his armor bearer to take his life. And the armor bearer, and it's important if you're ever teaching this, the armor bearer says he was too afraid to do that to Saul. And this was the fear the Amalekite did not have, that David ends up punishing him for. So his armor bearer was too afraid, so Saul fell on his sword, and then the armor bearer fell on his sword. So what was the Amalekite doing there? The Amalekite was probably plundering the battlefield, came across Saul and thought, I can win a prize and get reward money from David, and boy, was he wrong. So this Amalekite shows up to Ziklag, announces it to David. And David says, how dare you not hesitate to kill the Lord's anointed? And that's kind of that last time you hear that with in concern with Saul of you should not raise your hand against the Lord's anointed. And the young man is put to death. Also, something that we didn't cover last time, but is in the very end of 1 Samuel, is the people of Ramoth Gilead on the other side of the Jordan, which would be, Jabesh Gilead, Jabesh Gilead. They go and take the bodies of Saul and his sons down off of the wall. When it says that they put them on the bodies on the walls of Beth Shan is right in this region right here. It's the closest major city to Mount Gilboa. And so the people from Jabesh Gilead take almost like a special forces because they had to sneak over to the city and take the bodies down, and then they bury them over in Jabesh Gilead. And David sends at that time a message to the people of Jabesh Gilead, blessing them for having done that with Saul, but then also letting them know that he had been anointed king of Judah in the city of Hebron. So David had moved from Ziklag. He goes to Hebron. When he goes to Hebron, he actually asks the Lord first, and he's got Abiathar, and who has the ephod and the Urim and Thummim, and you can tell again this is what's happening. He's saying, do I go up to Judah, yes or no? Yes, go up to Judah to become king. Which city do I go up to? And it comes down to Hebron, so he goes up to Hebron. What you see is David is consulting the Lord at every major decision, which is not what has been done up to this point. And so God leads him to go to Hebron. Hebron is one of the locations I wish I could have gotten to when we did our tour of Israel, but because of where it's at in the West Bank, we weren't able to take our rental car there because it would not have been covered by insurance if anything happened. But Hebron is also, you guys also know who is buried at Hebron. Do you know, Judy? Go for it.
I can't think of his name. Abraham.
Abraham, good.
And his wife.
Yep, Abraham and his wife are buried there at Hebron, and I think Isaac might be too, but I'm not sure. So if you go to Hebron today, they have the tombs of Abraham. That's a holy site for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so David goes to Hebron. This is the first capital. That's kind of the capital of Judah as a tribe. When he moves to Hebron at this point, the Philistines probably still considered him an ally. Remember, he had been fighting with them. He did not join the battle so as to show that he would side with Saul. He's moved from Ziklag to Hebron, so the Philistines he's a friend of ours and we don't have anything to attack him. And this is interesting, and it goes to show this because in his 7 years of reigning in Hebron, the Philistines do not attack him. But the very moment he moves into Jerusalem as king of all of Israel, Philistines show up in force to come after him. So here, the elders of Judah anoint him king, and this is when David blesses Jabesh Gilead for having taken the bodies of Saul's sons from the gates of Beth Shan. And then when he does this, the elders of the northern tribes of Israel, it seems from one of the passages that they may have wanted David to be king. But it says that Abner took Ishbaal, so both Ishbosheth and Mephibosheth, their names were actually Ishbaal and Mephibaal, most likely. So Bosheth means shame. So Ishbaal would be man of the Lord, or the Lord's man. Baal actually just means Lord, and it's used that way in Hebrew at times for humans. It's not always just the idol. And so Ishbaal would basically be like the Lord's man, and then I'm not sure what the first part of Mephibosheth would be, but basically to say Ishbosheth is to say man of shame instead. And so some of the latter Hebrew scribes replaced the Baal because Baal was a bad thing to them. They would replace that part of a name with Bosheth, shame, in order to shame the name of Baal. So their names are Ishbaal and not Ishbosheth. So Abner takes, who is Saul's military commander, takes Saul's one remaining son, well, not the only remaining son, but the one from his first wife, and makes him the king of the northern tribes of Israel. The fact that it says Abner makes him this, and not necessarily that the tribes went along with Abner, but Abner seems to really be the one who is the real power, and people weren't going to stand up to Abner. And the capital is moved to Mahanaim, which is on the other side of the Jordan, because the Philistines have now basically taken over the whole part that you see purple. They've defeated Israel here up at the Mount Gilboa, and it says that they came in and they settled in those cities. So this is really the high water mark of the Philistine culture in the Promised Land. This is when they have the most control, and basically from this point on, they're going to shrink and eventually get to where they're not really a major factor in things. So David does not contest Ishbaal being anointed king of Israel. He does not fight for the throne. He does not try to say, no, I should be king. He doesn't go and attack them and seek to take over. On the other hand, Israel ends up stirring up war with David and coming after David. Even when Ishbaal is killed later on, David waits for the elders of Israel to come willingly under his reign, which could be 5 years. Now, in the two reigns, it's kind of hard to figure out because it says David reigned in Hebron for 7.5 years, but Ishbaal reigned for 2 years. And it says it within the exact same passage. So what about the other 5 years? And was it all the 5 years before or after? So the timeline in the chart books that I gave you guys, you'll notice that I took the 2 years and kind of put it right in the middle of the 5 years. And I'm feeling guilty already, Judine, because I didn't print it out for you for this week, but I'll get it afterwards. Okay. But the 2 years, I put it kind of in the middle because it may have taken a while for the northern tribes to sit down and discuss whether or not they would take David or whether or not they would take Ishbaal, and to have all that happen, to move the capital and set him up and then finally crown him as king. So possibly at least a year doing that. For him to reign only 2 years and then, not be reigning because he's dead, when it seems that fairly quickly, David, becomes king. But that goes to show you that what can be seen fairly quickly in a narrative can take a couple years. And politics and stuff don't move as quickly as we often think. The reason why I say the elders may have wanted David right away is that when Abner finally gets mad at Ishbaal and says, I'm going to go hand the kingdom over to David, when he speaks to the elders of Israel, he speaks of, you have long wanted David to be your king. Now's the time to do that. So it says that they've long waited. So I feel that the northern tribes actually would have preferred David to have become king right away. But instead, Abner kind of held that off by being loyal to the house of Saul. Part of that being because he was related to Saul, and that probably made a big emphasis for him. So David and ambition, you see with David being willing and all these things, he was a great example of waiting on the Lord. He waited on the Lord. Dude, should I go up or should I not go up? Should I go to, where should I be? Here. They're not ready to have me king. I'll wait to be made king. And he's a great example of that. And yes, he has some definite faults and sins that we're going to see as we go through his life, but that's one of the reasons why he's named a man after God's own heart. because as sinful as every man is, he still saw God as God and honored him and let him be the one who guided everything that he did. Now, when the northern tribes chose to go with Ishbaal, David honored that, didn't contest it. But what ends up happening is at the pool of Gibeon, Abner brings some of the troops from northern Israel and is there, and Joab goes out to meet him. Now, the pool of Gibeon is basically right here. So it's right on the border between northern Israel and southern in Judah, basically. And so Abner bringing his forces there would have caused Joab to show up to meet him, and they meet on either side of this pool. And it's interesting because it's similar to the Civil War in America. I don't know if any of you are Civil War buffs, but one of the more amazing thoughts is the number of the northern and southern generals and officers who were together over in California only months before they had to go back home and fight against each other. And it's similar here. So all of these people, Abner, Joab, and all of them, they knew each other. They knew who the other one was. Not that they were always allied, because Saul kept trying to kill David, but they did know who the other soldiers and commanders were. So when they go out and meet, they're kind of talking back and forth at this pool. And then Abner puts out this challenge of, why don't you have 12 of your young men come out, and I'll have 12 of my young men come out, and we'll see them have this contest. Now, the passage isn't really clear to make it absolutely certain, because it doesn't say necessarily who of which ones killed which. But what it appears to be is that Abner's men pulled their swords out, and where it was supposed to be a hand-to-hand combat challenge, they just grabbed them and killed them instead in order to start the battle. Or it may be that they were contesting with swords, and it just started as a contest and just grew into a battle. It's not super clear which one happened. But as this battle goes on and rages, Joab, who is David's commander, has two of his brothers there with him, and Asahel is his youngest brother, and he's said to be very fleet of foot, and so he's fast. And he has on his mind, I'm going to take out Abner. If I can get him, what a prize to say I took out the commander of Israel's army. So he's chasing Abner, and Abner's running from him saying, don't. He actually calls back, is that you, Asahel? Yeah, don't do this. I don't know what I'm going to be able to say to your brother if I have to kill you. Nope, he was still going to chase him. And it seems that while he was pursuing, he kind of basically stopped and just rammed his spear back, because he actually uses the butt of his spear, not the sharp end, but the blank end, to put right through Asahel's stomach. And basically everyone that was pursuing them was stopped by that, and it allowed Abner and some of his forces to get away. And they run, and basically Joab and his brother find out what happened to Asahel, and they're like, this is, we're going after you. So they chased him down, and it's not until Abner gets into a city and calls out and says, hey, how long are we going to keep this fight going, that they break off that battle. However, right after that, it says that there was a long war between the North and the South, and it went for 7.5 years. And so that war had battles in it, but we're not really told a lot about those battles. And so there's that contesting going back and forth between them. During this war, the house of David is growing stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul is growing weaker and weaker. But as the house of Saul is growing weaker, Abner is becoming more and more important and more powerful in that house. And so what ends up happening then is, I forgot I had these pictures. This is the pool of Gibeon today, if it's the same location that they think. You can see how they would be sitting on either side of that, jawing back and forth, and no one really jumping into the pool. This is another view from up above. In here in the background, Jerusalem would be basically about where you see these buildings, but on the other side of this hill. And so you can't quite see where it is, but you can see that it's not far at all from Jerusalem. So Abner then, he goes and he is serving Ishbaal, and he ends up defecting to David. What happens is Ishbaal accuses him of having slept with one of Saul's concubines. Now, that was an issue to Ishbaal, and you'll see it becomes an issue later with Solomon, where Solomon's brother, one of the other sons of David, wishes to have the final concubine of David, who he did not have relations with. She was somebody that, in essence, was a caretaker of David in his age, but he wished to have her as a wife, and he asked Bathsheba, and Bathsheba allows him. And to Solomon, that's an act of treason, because he's trying to vie for power through marrying into that relationship. So the fact that Ishbaal was upset with Abner is not that out of whack. That this wasn't just, oh, you had a relationship with somebody. He sees it as a play for power, and it could have been a play for power. But Abner basically gets really mad at him, and he's like, I fought and been loyal to the house of Saul all these years, and you're going to go after me for some issue with a woman. And so then he goes to David and seeks to hand the kingdom over to David. Now, when Abner goes to do that, that means he goes into Hebron, meets with David, and David lets him go. And meanwhile, Joab and his brothers were gone doing another battle, and they get back and they hear that Abner, the killer of their brother, came into Hebron and left peaceably without David doing anything. And they weren't happy about that. And so Joab sends a messenger to Abner to have him come back. And when Abner comes back, Joab and his brother take Abner aside and they kill him in cold blood. This actually was a very risky thing at this point, because he was one of the most powerful people with the northern tribes, and everything could fall apart if David didn't do what he did. But what David does is he openly condemns the actions of Joab and his brother, separates himself from their actions, publicly mourns and fasts the death of Abner, and basically goes out of his way to make sure that people know he had no part in the death of Abner. At this point, people would realize everyone in the country would have known that Joab's brother was killed by Abner. And so everyone would understand why that was what happened. So then, it's interesting with Joab. Joab does not get off free for this murder of Abner. David, interestingly, during his life, can't bring himself to kill Joab for this murder. However, at his death, he tells Solomon, don't let Joab go to his grave with his head. You don't let him basically go to his grave comfortable. He has to pay for the murder of Abner. And you see this with David. You see this sense of he knew these things were wrong, but he also knew how loyal those people had been to them. He was great friends with them, and he couldn't bring himself to pull the full punishment that the person probably deserved because of that. And then the death of Ishbaal is that once Abner is dead, all of Israel is now upset. And so Ishbaal has two lesser commanders that they just did raiding parties. They are thinking they have a way of getting ahead. There's no pun intended. But by going in and killing Ishbaal and taking his head to David. Clearly, they did not hear about the guy that showed up to talk about Saul's death. And when they show up to David, David actually says, to them, how can you, if I did this to the one who killed Saul, in other words, at Saul's request on a battlefield, then how much more to those who murdered an innocent man in his own bedroom? And so he has the two of them put to death. Now, David refers to Ishbaal in these passages as righteous. You read about Ishbaal, you don't really see him as like this really good person and wonderful person. And this kind of brings out that difference between what we mean when we say somebody is a good person and somebody is a righteous person. And so, when Paul says, for instance, no one would die for a righteous person, maybe for a good person. And there's that distinction, like, well, what's the difference? Well, he was righteous because in no way did the law ask for his death. In other words, he did not deserve what he got, so he was righteous in that way. And so they should not have killed him. He had done nothing to deserve death. So at this point, once Ishbaal is dead, there still is a time period before all of the tribes come together and take David as king, which would have factored into that 7.5 years that he's king just in Hebron. So while he's in Hebron, he's reigning there 7 years. He takes more wives and he has more children while he is there. He's not actually seeking to expand his kingdom. There probably would have been raiding parties and things like that, but he wasn't seeking, it seems, to expand his kingdom much. But during this time, his army is increasing and still getting good experiences. They are raiding into things. And I say raiding because that's where Joab and his brothers were when Abner came. It says that they had gone out on raids and had brought the plunder back. So, at this point, David is anointed king of Israel by all of the tribes. And when the leaders come to him, they also bring different soldiers to go toward his army. So it's kind of, here's the enlistment, and they're saying, we are pledging these troops to you. So the additions to David's army, there's 6,800 given from Judah, which he would have already had a good number from Judah at that point. The Levites provide 8,300. Simeon, 7,100. Benjamin, 3,000. Now you get these. Ephraim is 20,800. Manasseh is 18,000. So, and remember, Ephraim and Manasseh are half tribes. And so really from the tribe of Joseph, you have 38,800 soldiers, which then Naphtali has 38,000 and Zebulun has 50,000. This is really interesting that Zebulun and Naphtali, which are not large tribes, would have so many more soldiers. It may be because if you look at where Zebulun and Naphtali are, they're right where the Philistines are, and they may not have very many other homes to do, and they have to defend it. So those that were in those deeply affected places of the Philistines may have pledged more men, but otherwise we don't really know why you have some of these smaller, otherwise lesser tribes as being the ones that give so many. Issachar gives 200 chiefs plus their kinsmen. So it doesn't give the actual number that they have, but the 200 chiefs, if they had like say, 100 people following each chief, that would be about 20,000 there. And then the tribes east of the Jordan, so the Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben altogether give 120,000. And so it's interesting to look through these numbers and see the differences in the tribe. You'd almost have thought that Ephraim and Manasseh would have given more. Simeon, anybody remember where Simeon is? They don't actually have a tribal land. They have multiple cities within Judah. The Levites would have also had multiple cities within the different lands, but also in Judah. And Benjamin was right next to Judah. So Benjamin probably had the least. Anyone want to guess why Benjamin has only 3,000? Wild guess?
Didn't they go to war with him, or would that already taken place about that time?
You're close in the idea they almost went to war with
All
him.
the 600 he killed.
Well, that was back in the Judges. Who is from the tribe of Benjamin?
Saul.
Saul. Yeah, they didn't like switch power. So they didn't have as many, coming out. They were a smaller tribe, though, as well. So you add those two together, and that's why you only have that many coming out. So basically at this time, his army was well over 300,000 strong. If you want to know about how that measures, that's bigger than our current army in the U.S. of active duty soldiers. So it's a big army that's pledged to him. When I was I'll say this. When I was in the Army back in 1996, we had 260-something thousand soldiers active duty at that time. All right. So, at this point, because David is no longer king of just Judah, he decides to have a new capital. This new capital is a city called Jebus, that is inhabited by the Jebusites. We now know it as Jerusalem. It was not under Israelite control until after David. So in all those years up to that time, Jerusalem was not one of the major cities inhabited by God's people. So the location, probably chosen because it is more central within the Promised Land, and it had no prior tribal affiliation because it was a Gentile city still at this time. It wasn't like, you're coming from the tribe of Judah or the tribe of this. Now, it is barely into the land of Judah. Jerusalem is actually right on the border of Benjamin and Judah. And so in that way, it would have seen a nice split between those two tribes. One of the great things about Jerusalem is it's extremely defensible because of the hills that it's on, and it also has a very strong flowing natural spring right accessible to the city. And if you're going to withstand a siege, you need a source of fresh water. And so that's really why David wanted to move from Hebron up to Jerusalem. So this is a picture, one of the best that I was able to find, of what this would actually be Jerusalem at the time of Solomon. You might have had actual, buildings and houses outside the city along this hill here, though. But at the time that David is attacking, it's only this lower half that is actually part of the city. The Jebusites dwelling here felt that it was impregnable. Now, what you do not get from this picture is that this valley and this valley are actually pretty deep valleys. They're gorgeous, and they actually have cliffs at certain points that go down. And this at the end would have also been steep at the time. It is no longer today, but it was at least not like it was back then. So the only way really to attack would have been through the gate right here, and you'd have to come here from this upper part. So you really only had to defend this small little portion, because the ability of an attacker to climb up the cliffs and get above the walls and everything just wasn't going to happen. And so so that's why the Jebusites are like, we don't need to worry about this. They said the blind and the lame could defend against you guys. And so David basically says, whoever can take this city, they're going to have to go and take the blind and the lame, and he's going to have to do it by climbing the water shaft. Now, it's actually debated as to what the water shaft is. But in the Gihon Spring, which is here on the side of the city, they have evidence that there was a slight defensive position around the spring, and there are ways that they had kind of channeled it into the city in a cave. And in that cave is a place where there's a vertical shaft that then goes over into the actual city. So outside, this would have been the walls of that city. Outside, you had access to the spring, but it would flow into this tunnel, and then you had this vertical shaft, and then this horizontal tunnel that would go past the walls and up and in. There's a lot of debate with archaeologists whether this was ever used like, a well, dropping buckets down, because you can see this is an actual picture of that hole. This is one I took when I was there, as well as this. this shows you how kind of far down you're. This picture right here is from this portion of the tunnel, and then this one is that shaft right there. So when David says you have to climb up this is about what you'd be facing. Somebody would have had to first climb up kind of freehand and then possibly drop a ladder down so that others could come up behind them. It's about 35 foot down, and that opening at most points, as you can tell from the gentleman climbing here, it's not like you can just easily wedge yourself on either side. So Joab, who took Jerusalem, would have had to climb up this in the dark. I mean, unless he had flame on his head for a headlamp. But they had to have some sort of light. He'd have to climb up, which would have been very challenging. And so the Jebusites probably did not think that this was a very risky situation. But they did end up sneaking in there. Joab took his men, snuck up into that area, and were able to get into the city and to take it. So then, with this new capital, Joab ends up rebuilding the old city. So in taking it, there would have been, burning things down and such like that. So he is rebuilding that section. And then David builds up the defenses of the city and expands it. So he expands it to the north on that hill, and it talks in Scripture about the Milo. And there's a lot of discussion amongst archaeologists of what is the Milo and what is it specifically referring to. What is not able to be gained today at looking at Jerusalem is that between the old city here and where David expands it, there was likely a saddle in that ridge that created even a greater defensive position. And it seems that they filled in the Milo, filled in whatever that was. We don't know what the Milo, like in Hebrew, it's Milo, and we don't know what the word means. We have no idea. And so when you go to Jerusalem, you can actually see, and I should have put a picture in here, but you can see this wall of rock where they did a retaining wall that probably filled in that saddle so that David could expand it further north up the hill. All of this, by the way, is a pretty steep downhill. From here up to there, it's not level. It's a steep uphill climb plus cliffs on either side. When David expands the city to the north, the king of Tyre actually comes down and, in a way of tribute to David, basically builds David a palace for him using cedars from Lebanon. And this is seen as David as just an affirmation from God and a confirming of his kingship. So, once David gets into Jerusalem, the Philistines now go, wait a minute. He may not be our ally. We don't know what else happened, but David is becoming very powerful. All those armies came, and the Philistines probably said, we better attack now before he gets stronger. So the Israelites come, and they come against Jerusalem, and they settle their army in the valley of Rephaim, which is right outside of Jerusalem. So if you go to Jerusalem today and you get up onto the Jaffa Gate, which is the western side of the old city, you would look out from that tower. This is they call it David's Tower, but King Herod's the one that had originally built it, and it's been rebuilt by the Crusaders and the Muslims since then. But if you're standing on a tower looking out over Jerusalem, the valley that you see right here, that is the valley of Rephaim. So you're in Jerusalem, you're looking at the army of the Philistines. It's not they're somewhere in the distance. They're right there, parked outside of Jerusalem. And so in the first battle, the Philistines are encamped there, and David inquires of the Lord, Should I attack or should I not? Again, you see in his practice, I'm not just going to go and attack. And it's interesting, yours, like Saul, just like he got filled with the Spirit in his first kingly attack that he does, and he just like, we're going to go do this, but there wasn't always that sense of, I got to consult the Lord. David always consulting the Lord. And when he's told to attack and he'll prevail, he attacks and he does prevail. So then the Philistines return to the Valley of Rephaim to reform and attack one more time. And this time David is told to go covertly around them and hide in the woods in the forest on the other side. And so while he's there, he's told you need to wait till you hear the marching in the trees, and then you go. And he does that, and then he defeats them a second time and is able to drive them back into the land of Philistia. Basically, as a result of these two battles, the Philistines cease to be the major threat that they were, and he kind of takes their power, and he begins to now dominate this area, and the Philistines lose the control that they had. And basically, the Philistines become lesser and lesser of a people until during Hezekiah they're fully conquered and Israel completely dwells in their land. They still remain as a people group in their 5 cities, but they no longer rebel against Israel. They no longer try to become their own nation, and they almost actually blend with it. But in the prophets, the Philistines are actually said that I'm going to make them part of Israel. And so even to a certain sense, the fulfillment of that during the time of the Gospels, as people from those cities came to know Christ, is kind of a neat thing to think about. So, David now being in Jerusalem, back in Deuteronomy, they had talked about God putting his name at a particular place, and Jerusalem becomes that place where God puts his name. Now, this is not known immediately. So even during the reign of David, you have the ark in a tent in Jerusalem. You have the tabernacle in a different location, as we're going to see in just a bit. We still hear at different times in David's story, for instance, when he's fleeing from Absalom, that there's a worship site on top of the Mount of Olives. And so there's still worship sites at different places. Does anyone remember when Jerusalem specifically becomes the place chosen where God's going to place his name? Where it's finally solidified? So it's actually at the end of David's life when the plague comes as a result of his counting his men. And it is where the angel was standing when the plague ceased that becomes the site that David buys to put the temple. And so he does that because that's where the angel was. And that's, in a sense, how God kind of put his name there. However, this isn't just a random choosing. So while God had first placed the tabernacle at Shiloh, and it was there for about 300 years, when it's placed at Jerusalem and lasts for 380 years, there's a significant meaning to it being there. It's in 2 Chronicles 3:1 that the Temple Mount is specifically called Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah is the mountain where Abraham had the near sacrifice of Isaac, which was a picture of Christ. And so this results in Jesus being crucified then on the exact same mountain where Isaac was nearly sacrificed by Abraham. So that has a lot to do with why Jerusalem was probably chosen. So when you look at this in the Old Testament, because Deuteronomy says, I'm going to have this place, this will be where it is. Once the temple is built, as we'll hear about next time with Solomon, then that was supposed to be the place where you worship God. You were not supposed to have the other places of high places and places to do sacrifices. When I say the place to worship God, the place to offer your sacrifices. You weren't supposed to offer sacrifices wherever. So all subsequent kings then, after David, as you guys are going to read through 1 Kings and 2 Kings, all of them are going to be asking, did they or did they not allow the high places to continue? And as we go through that in the next few weeks, it gives a pretty good sense of how we should feel about the aspects of Christianity that are synchronisms of the surrounding culture. How we should feel, because in essence, the high places are not always torn down, but the king is still a good king. But God would have been more pleased if he had torn down the high places. So in other words, it's like when there are these synchronisms within culture, it's not like that person is now evil, but did he go to the nth degree to be pleasing to God? And so we're going to see that play out as we go through 1st and 2nd Kings. The other thing, northern Israel is eventually judged for not recognizing Jerusalem as the chosen place. And Judah is judged for having other high places in addition to Jerusalem. Part of the reason why I want to emphasize this to you guys is when it comes down to reading the Old Testament and putting it into ways that it matches our life. Like if you're trying to teach this to somebody or even read it for yourself, so how does this apply to me? It helps when we can understand how these high places correspond with things in our lives today. And it's going to help us to realize, if we stop and think how hard it was for these Israelites, we like, well, why were you so dumb? Why didn't you tear down the high places? It was hard for them to do it. They would have had to go against a lot of culture, a lot of pressure, a lot of people that really liked the high places or liked the different things. And there wasn't this, there were people that could have easily argued using passages of scripture, well, Samuel offered at the high place, they had this high place. I mean, there's ways they could have gotten around it. You had to know Deuteronomy. You had to know what all of scripture said, not just a certain portion of it or not just tradition, to be able to realize that God was going to be more pleased with one thing or another. And that helps train our heart to kind of know, how to react to some of the things that we will encounter in our lives. So, with Jerusalem being the place, David seeks to bring the ark there. And again, he's moving the ark to Jerusalem because that's where he's at. He wants it to be a place where the temple is going to be. So he asks to have the ark brought from Kiriath Jearim. And this is where we've already talked about this back when we talked about the ark being taken captive to begin with, where Uzzah ends up touching it and dying. And David is angry because here he was doing something he thought God would be pleased with. I'm bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And then a guy dies, and seems like God's mad. And this is why David's anger probably was more toward God, like, why? And then he would have gone back and inquired and found out, because we did it wrong. So then the ark resided in the house of Obed-Edom, and then eventually is brought by the Levites up to the city of David. You guys will remember this slide here. Now, Michal, which was Saul's daughter that David married, is very critical of David dancing before the ark because she thought it was unfitting of a king. Now, one, she was the daughter of Saul, so she, sits there and has her ideas about how a king should be. But there's also a hint that things had changed between Michal and David. If you remember, when David had to flee from Saul and run, Saul married Michal off to another man. When David came into the whole throne, in fact, when Abner came and said, hey, I'm offering the kingdom to you, David basically says, sure, except you have to bring Michal, my wife, or we're not even talking. And so they had to go and take the wife and take Michal from her current husband and bring her to David. And it says that her husband followed after her weeping. So it seemed that they had a good relationship. And so it may be that as she's just ripped from that relationship, she no longer has this, crush on David. Not to mention she was his wife, and now she's one of multiple wives, which probably would ruin just about any marriage relationship. So when she comes in, she probably didn't have that great a relationship with David to begin with, and then she criticizes David for dancing. Now, it says after this that Michael went to the end of her days and did not have any children. What's not really clear is the why. Is that because God was mad at her for criticizing David because he was celebrating the ark, and David was completely righteous in that? Was that why she didn't have children? Or is it because David and Michael didn't come together after that to have kids because the relationship was that broken? It's not really clear which one it is. But just in that risk that sometimes people will say, well, that's really unfair of God that, he would do that, as a punishment to Michael, but it may not have been God's punishment. It may just have been their marriage was broken at that point and they did not reconcile. So at this point, as we said, there's two places of worship for sure. The ark resided in the city of David in a tent that's set up by David, and it's served by Asaph. Anybody recognize that name? Asaph?
Writer of music.
Yeah.
And songs.
So he was in essence the head of worship. Wrote many of the psalms that we have, and so he and his brothers and Obed-Edom and his brothers ministered before the ark, with Obed-Edom and Hosea being the gatekeepers to that. Gatekeepers here being probably a more prominent thing than it sounds. And this tent is set up in Jerusalem. The tabernacle, meanwhile, is residing at the high place of Gibeon, and Zadok and his brothers are ministering there, and they're the ones carrying out the daily sacrifices and other offerings on the altar. How long this was the case, we're not told. We do know that when Absalom takes on or tries to overthrow David, that both Zadok and Abiathar take the ark and meet David, and David's like, no, take the ark back into Jerusalem. He doesn't say take the ark back to the tabernacle. So it may have eventually, I'm sorry, it wouldn't have gone to that, but we don't know when, how long that would have been the case. But both Zadok was involved in the carrying of that ark. Also, the fact that here is David in this palace built of cedar by the king of Tyre, and then here's God's ark worship being done in a tent. And so David is feeling almost guilty with that and really wanting to build the Lord a house. Now, to give you guys an idea, Gibeon, where the tabernacle is approximately 3 miles from Jerusalem. So they were pretty close to each other, but they still were not at the same location. So Jerusalem, David desires to build the temple, and God basically responds, hey, all these years I've been fine with the tent. So why now do I need to have this house? Why do you think God responds that way to David? Because he's pleased. He's very clearly pleased that David wants to build him a house. And he eventually says, not you because you're a man of blood, but Solomon instead. But why would God be sure to tell him this? And he says something very similar to Solomon, too, when he goes to build the temple.
He's always been in a tent. He didn't feel he needed. I don't know.
Because...
He doesn't dwell in tents.
What's that?
He doesn't dwell in tents. God doesn't.
Well, he did until this point, he says.
Yes.
Yeah, and part of it is the tent, the tabernacle, was just meant to be, I am present with you. He didn't need a house. So what he says to Solomon is, the earth, the heavens are my throne and the earth is my footstool. So in other words, there's this very clear statement of, it's almost like, you can do this, but understand this is for you. I have no need for a house. I am who I am. The house is to indicate my presence with you, and that's done by a tabernacle every bit as much as it is a temple. And so God, in a sense, is saying this to prevent the theology from going wrong about who he is and making him small, like the gods that had their images in their temples and things like that. However, David wanting to build the house is something that is pleasing to God. It shows David's heart of love for God, and God's response to David after telling him he can't be the one to do it is that since you had this in your heart, this is when he tells him, a descendant of yours from your body will dwell on this throne forever. And that is the promise that you have of Solomon, for one, because it's a promise that he will be there. And you say, well, how is it just Solomon? Why isn't it just Jesus? Well, in that prophecy, it says, and when he sins, I will correct him. And that's not talking about Jesus. And so it also has the human object of that prophecy. But then Jesus also fulfills this in keeping with Zechariah 6:9-13 and Hebrews 1:5. And so basically, David wants to build the house. God is pleased with this. But David is not able to build the house because why? I've said it already, but what's the reason?
Man of war.
He's a man of war and a man of blood. Now we got to think about this. So, were the people that David killed in the will of the Lord? And if so, why would they keep him from building God's house? What do you guys think? So 2 things. There were some that he killed that may not have been in God's will. The 200 Philistines that he went and jumped and killed in order to get foreskins to marry a woman may not have been within God's will. There are other things when David is pleading, that certain things not be held against him. There's a lot of stuff that, within the things that are happening when he's fleeing. When remember when he's at Ziklag, they're going to those Amalekite cities and just destroying all of them. Now, the Amalekites were supposed to be destroyed by Saul, so that would be like, that was still, in a sense, in the will of God. But even with all those things being in the will of God, God is saying, I don't want the one who builds my house to be one who is known within the world as a shedder of blood. Solomon ends up building the Lord's house. How many conquests did Solomon have? None. And it's interesting within the plan of God how he brings about in David he does the conquest, brings about what was supposed to be, and and for the most part that was all within God's will. But God wants to make sure that in that's due to this sinful world, but God is now establishing a kingdom where there's going to be peace, and he wants to be known by that instead. And so that's why David is not able to build the temple, because he did not exemplify that. And then the understanding of God and what his actual heart and his desire is. He's not this God of war. He's not a God that's out there for conquest. The conquest happened to fulfill a promise. It didn't happen because God was power hungry. And so David is not allowed to build the temple, but he provides everything for the temple. So when Solomon goes to build the temple, it's already mostly done. So, for instance, a lot of the blocks would have been cut already, and you had the bronze for all of the articles, and in fact, they probably had a lot of the articles already made. So basically, David had it all set so that when Solomon became king, he could go right into building it, and the materials were already there. Interestingly, later on, when that temple is destroyed, it's rebuilt by Ezra and during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, but then that's refurbished by King Herod. Herod was not allowed by the Jews to do anything to the temple until he had done the same thing David did. So King Herod actually amassed all of the wealth and everything that was going to go into the refurbishing of the temple before the Jews ever let him touch anything. And he was more than willing to do that. I can't wait till we get to talk about that, but later, much later. So David expands the kingdom. He first takes on Philistia and completely isolates them. He takes on Moab and Edom and Syria and Zobah. Let me just bring these up a second here. So what ends up happening is David, when he comes to his kingdom, Ammon, there was a king in Ammon that he was actually friendly with, and that king dies, and David sends people to say, hey, I'm sad that your father died, but I want to renew our friendship. But the advisors to the new young king say, oh, he's coming to spy everything out. So they make the spies or the messengers shave half their beards, and they cut off their cloaks at the hip, so they have to shamedly walk back basically half-bearded and mini-skirted. And so David, as a result, goes and he attacks Ammon. Ammon calls upon Syria to provide troops. Syria provides troops. David defeats all of them. Then Syria gets upset, and they pull from all of these guys up here and come down and attack, and David defeats them. And then David goes up and he defeats another king up here in Hamath, and then kings that were dominated by that king pay him tribute. And so David, in this time, with his relationship with the king of Tyre and Sidon and Phoenicia coming in where he has treaties with them, the Syria, Zobah, and Hamath actually are paying him tribute, and he has control and has stationed soldiers all the way up into that area. He conquers Ammon, Moab, and Edom, and takes control of this entire area. So, what's significant about that?
Fulfills the promise that God had made Abraham.
Yep. This is, as it says in your notes, the high water mark. I think it says in the notes, the high water mark of the Old Testament. So everything from Abraham call has been pointing to this moment when David conquers from the river of Egypt all the way up to the great river Euphrates. And Solomon really is the true high water mark. That's probably why it'll be in the notes later if it's not in there right now. Because Solomon, after this is all conquered, he reigns in this area in total peace with everybody coming to him for wisdom. And it's actually a very strong picture of kind of the end we're promised in the final end. And God brings that about. Now, once that happens, though, it starts falling apart and going down from there, which is in a sense why God says there was a need for a new covenant that gets introduced in the time of Jeremiah. So now that Scripture talks about this conquest, you'll notice it does not go into great detail about a lot of the battles. It has a few of the battles. There's a lot of stuff we're not told. When you take and realize how many years are being written about, you do not get much detail at all. Most of the stuff we know about David from this point on are stories of what's happening in his family. We're not told about conquests and government and such. Now, when David comes to this full power, he seeks to pass on God's kindness, and he basically asks, is there still someone from the house of Saul that I can show kindness to? And this shows, he's a man after God's own heart. The grace he receives, he wants to give. And so the one that's brought to his attention is Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth was 5 years old when Saul was killed on Mount Gilboa, and he was a son of Jonathan. And when they were fleeing after the defeat, he was dropped and his legs were lame. It seems that he may have still been able to possibly walk, but using other things, because they're talking about him coming and falling before David, whereas if he was completely lame, he'd already be down there. And so it may be that he was able to walk, but just had bad feet from having been broken. David brings him in and he gives him all of the land of Saul, and he gives that land to him. But then he takes also a servant of Saul and makes the servant head over that land, because Mephibosheth is going to stay with David in his palace and eat from his table, and yet he's going to gain his wealth from the land of Saul, and this servant is given control of that land. Mephibosheth eating at the table, David's table, is a great picture of us. But this pair of Mephibosheth and the overseer of his land, we're going to see in just a few moments, that becomes a big issue because they both kind of contest something when David's authority is challenged. So we're going to see if we can get through this second one, and it looks like, I know what happened. Hold on just a second. Why did that not do what I needed it to do? We're just going to do it this way. All right. Do we start off with David's government?
Yeah.
All right. There we are. So is that easier to read in the back? Okay. I think, yeah, so it'll be, we'll stick with that. So, with David's government, the first time that Israel is the dominant power in the region. Now, this is happening toward the end of that Bronze Age collapse. So we talked about that a while back, where all of the nations just in essence, fall apart, and there is no dominant empire. Egypt is not powerful at this point. Assyria is not powerful at this point. Hittites are not powerful at this point. And instead there's here is David. And in other words, the Bronze Age collapses is there, and then the next thing on the stage is David and Solomon. And you see then, in a sense, that potential for Israel to have established itself as a power for quite a long time, had they been faithful. He was probably the strongest king in this entire time, and Solomon definitely seems to be, for sure, the strongest king at this time. His court, there are two lists that are provided, one in 2 Samuel 8, 15 to 18, and then 2 Samuel 20, 23 to 26. When it says that certain people sat at the king's table, it probably means that they were a salaried worker. In other words, it's showing how much wealth he has to be able to support that many people in his administration. A lot of the people that are mentioned would have been people that he's paying for and taking care of. And you'll notice the biggest thing is if you compare Saul's court to David's court, they're worlds apart. Saul had a few of his own his own family, and it was very strongly just within his tribe, not very big, not very many officials. David, the other direction. It's actually quite more involved with multiple tribes and more cosmopolitan in a sense. That's why you have one of his commanders being a Hittite, and there are actually a number of Gentiles there participating with what's happening with Israel during this time. So the prophets, there is Gad and Nathan that are officially mentioned. They provide a role to the king that this is the initial role that prophets play. So in this stage, the prophets you'd be called, prophets in the court of the king. So all the way up through Isaiah, you're having some of these prophets, but with this period, you don't have somebody like Isaiah who's writing. So Gad, Nathan, they talk to the king. They're not writing books. There are other prophets that are going to occur during the other kings. They're prophesying to the king, giving direction. They're not writing books. Then you get to Elijah and Elisha. They're prophesying to the king. They're not writing books. And then after Elijah and Elisha, now you start having the prophets that are coming in, and they're going to start writing books. Isaiah is one of the first ones of those to do that, and that's why he's called the Prince of the Prophets. He's the first one to really start writing down his prophecies, in that we now have them in books of the Bible. The priests, you have Zadok through Eleazar, and Abiathar through Ithamar, which Abiathar would then be a descendant of Levi, which is why we're going to find that he fades and Zadok comes to prominence. The Levites are organized into 24 courses, serving the sanctuary 1 week at a time. This is a tradition that continues all the way through to the time of Jesus. This is why Zechariah is said to be in the temple when his order was on deck for doing the responsibilities there. Ira the Jerite is mentioned, and there's a sense of where he was like David's personal priest. How that actually worked out, but he was kind of an advisor, and this could have been his, like a scribe or a religious advisor to help him with the law, kind of like his personal pastor kind of thing. David's government was filled with intrigue at different times. Joab, who is his commander of his army and been with him from the very beginning, he has a lot of efforts to remain in power. When he murdered Abner, it was obviously because he had killed his little brother, but there's also, had Abner brought northern Israel into the whole kingdom and remained alive, David quite likely would have made Abner the captain of all of the armies of Israel. You also have the murder of Amasa, who was the commander of Judah's forces that Joab commits, again, to stay in power. When David says, whoever takes Jerusalem, I will make him a commander of my armies, that may have been a move by him to try to get Joab out of that position and get somebody else in that he just didn't want to have to deal with. But Joab was like, oh no, and he was the first one in to make sure that he got that. He's also the one who's responsible for killing Absalom, and then he eventually supports Adonijah over Solomon, which becomes his undoing. And it is, we're going to see Joab, this commander of David's army, is the one who runs to the horns of the altar pleading for mercy, but is actually put to death for his murders at that time. There's also competition a little bit between Zadok and Abiathar. We're not told a lot about it, but you see that Zadok is given charge over the ark, though Abiathar had been with David longer. And then Abiathar sides with Absalom and Adonijah in their bids for the throne. So it seems, in essence, Abiathar, though he had been with David longer, he was not having the prominence that he had had before. And so he saw Absalom and Adonijah as a way to step above Zadok. However, that was against the prophecy against Eli. And David was following after what he would have known from that. And remember, David knew Samuel and lived with Samuel for a time. So there's a good chance he knew all of that had happened. So the significant deeds from David's life, his kindness to Mephibosheth, we've talked about. Justice to the Gibeonites. There's a famine at a certain time, and they seek to find out why. They find out that it was because Saul had sought to put to death the Gibeonites when they were actually protected under a vow of Israel to Yahweh back at the conquest. Now remember, when Joshua came in, it was the Gibeonites that pretended to come from really far away, and they made a treaty with them and vowed to Yahweh that they would not conquer them. And because of that, that vow stood. So Saul, when he decided to attack the Gibeonites, did so against the will of the Lord. But he thought that, well, they're Canaanites. And this again goes to show that Saul, knew certain things, but did not know all of the story of the Old Testament and did not pay attention to Scripture close enough, or he would have known the Gibeonites would not to be lumped in with that. So as a result of that, David took some of the sons of Saul through his concubines and had them put to death, and then the famine went away. Now with this, then, you see some of the reality in the Old Testament of the concept of blood guilt upon the land. Now, in the law, you'll see that there's a place where if somebody was murdered somewhere in the land, and if you could not find who it was and bring them to justice, you had to take a bull out to that place and sacrifice the bull so that justice was done to remove the blood guilt from the land. You see some of this then in this Gibeonite incident, but it's also why David instructs Solomon to make sure that Joab is punished. So he has a very hard time doing that and is merciful, but he knows it has to happen or otherwise there might be blood guilt upon the land. So it's an interesting dynamic with that. And I really want to get to heaven and say, God, what were you thinking this whole time? We're like, David was supposed to be doing this or that. But if anything, it shows God's great patience with us. His condemned deeds, his adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband, Uriah the Hittite, and then the census of Israel when threatened by an adversary. So this first one we are pretty familiar about. This is the one that's recorded in the books of Samuel. Here the interesting thing is David commits adultery and murder. Why is he not removed as king?
Too powerful, maybe. I don't know.
Why doesn't God remove him as
Well,
king?
he asked for mercy. He recognized his sin.
Okay.
That-
He did ask for mercy.
Yes, but he recognized his sin. And so.
Okay. Today, if somebody falls into sin, there often tends to be like, well, then you're permanently done, and God's not going to use you again. And you have David here, who commits adultery, murders a man, and he remains king.
Did he already have a promise though from God? I mean,
The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Did God not know when he made David king what would happen?
yes.
Mm-hmm.
So he still made him king. You see this with Saul as well. And the reason I bring this up is that I think sometimes we've gotten to certain places where it's like, when somebody, has a failure, that, they're just done and there's no way that they can serve anymore. I have people that I won't give exactly who they are, but people that I know that I love dearly, who they got pregnant before they were married, and they went for years in the church feeling they couldn't serve anywhere. They felt like they had been blacklisted, like they had the scarlet letter on their chest. Instead of being able to confess, go through a time of living in repentance and establishing their character and then being restored. The church is horrible at restoring people. And we typically don't actually do that. And there is this idea that, when somebody commits something, then God just can't use them anymore. David, you can't get a whole lot worse than this. And yet David was kept in his kingdom and God still worked in him. Now, does that mean that what he did had no consequence? There's definitely consequences. And those consequences were things that God, brought about. But David was repentant. David did turn back to the Lord, or David would have been killed. So his adultery with Bathsheba, he commits adultery with Bathsheba. She is pregnant. He has Uriah killed, and then you have basically the prophet coming to him, Nathan, saying, giving him the parable of the sheep. And here's this rich man with all these sheep, and this poor man with just one sheep. And the rich man takes the poor man's one sheep. David is incensed and says, that man must die. And Nathan says, that's you. Man, you talk about guts. Going into a king who could take your life and confronting him like that. David's response is repentance. Now, God basically said in response, at first, through Nathan, you've declared your own justice, you shall die. That was the actual punishment. The punishment was death. David offered the broken and contrite heart. When he says later in the Psalms, you know, the bulls you did not want, sacrifice you did not want, but you wanted a broken and contrite heart. David gives that broken and contrite heart, and God basically, Nathan says, you're forgiven. You're forgiven, and so you will not die. But the child from the union dies. What else is promised as a result of that?
His house, the blood would never leave his house.
Yep. So the sword would never depart from his house, and he would have people from his own family who would rise up against him, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason why everything following Bathsheba is in the record, it's not his battles, it's not his conquests, it's not his ruling, it's nothing. It is the fulfillment of that. Because now all of a sudden you go straight from the Bathsheba incident, and now you've got Amnon and Tamar, and then Absalom killing Amnon, and then Absalom rising up. I mean, you see it's recorded there because it's the fulfillment of that prophecy of Nathan against David, and it's showing us how that played out. So there was definite consequences, but God forgave him and didn't take his life.
Well, David knew what he was doing as he was going about having this affair and setting her husband up, Uriah, to get killed in battle. So he knew exactly what he was doing. There was no doubt in my mind that he knew what he was doing.
Right. Well, and the thing is, he got to a point, I think, and a lot of men, and probably women too, do this, and that is when you get older and you have certain levels of success, you stop being as fearful of the Lord. There's a sense of, I know how to do this, I know what I do, and I'm not seeking God in everything, I'm not doing that. And he seems to be going that direction at the time. I mean, that's part. I mean, he doesn't even go off to battle with Joab. He's staying back. Now, you see throughout all of Scripture that, and we're going to see as we go through the Kings, a lot of them didn't end well. And so, here he starts to go that direction and becomes careless in what he's doing. However, after this, there seems to be a certain sense of where he's kind of snapped out of that and humbled again. We can sit there and question his parenting decisions with Absalom and so on and so forth. But one thing that's clear is that from this point forward, every bad thing that happens to him, he accepts it. He doesn't push against it. He doesn't fight against it. Because he realized, this could be God's punishment for what I did. This could be God's punishment for what I did. That's why he doesn't put Shammai to death, as we're going to see. So there's a certain sense of David getting to a point where he knew what he did, accepted responsibility, confessed it, was forgiven in that he was not killed. He remained as king, and he still functioned, and God still walked with him. But the blessing that God would have given him was gone. And that's the big part to catch. In this life, when we talk about, fearing the Lord as a Christian, you're like, well, I'm forgiven. So if I do something really bad, then it's not, what's going to keep me from getting into heaven? I'm just going to get into heaven anyway. No. When you do certain things, especially if it shames the name of God, then there are some consequences, and there are ways that the blessing God would have poured out on you will not be poured out on you all the way to the day that you die. Now, once we die, however, we are forgiven, and we go into heaven, and we are all rewarded the same because in a sense we all get to be with Him for eternity. We all have the joy of eternal life and the inheritance of that true righteousness, that is there. And so you have that is there. But in this life, sin still has its consequence, not condemnation. Yeah.
2 years ago, I taught the life of David with the idea of trying to figure out why was he called a man after God's own heart. Samuel called him that before he even met him or knew anything about him. Mm-hmm. In Acts, Paul talks about the same thing, but then he adds, because he did what pleased me.
Mm-hmm.
And so my conclusion was that, especially from Psalm 32:1 or 2, blessed is the man whose sin God does not hold against him or count against him.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's actually what happened. You know, all of these bad things that happened in his family were not directly David's fault. These were sinful people who were committing all kinds of sinful things and deserved the death regardless of what David might have done. So if I'm taking this passage, to me it says that David felt that there wasn't any sin that was being held against him. It wasn't counted against him, and that's why he was pleasing God. And that's why he was a man after God's own heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also why we can be a person after God's own heart if we keep our lives pure through forgiveness and so on.
Yeah, I think were you implying then that the things that happened to David were not consequences of the Bathsheba thing?
There were consequences, but the fault was not David's. The fault was the people themselves, Joab and all of the people involved.
Yeah, and that's where the fault, definitely true. What you have is the way it is a consequence is that God could have moved so that it didn't happen. So in a sense, God could have had his hand on David's house so that David's house remained at peace. And there's ways he could have moved to do that. Because I believe it actually says in the passage that, I would have blessed you and given you all the more. But now, not going to happen. So, and to show that in a sense, when it says, now you will have this trouble in your house, that is because God, in a sense, allows that, whereas he might have prevented it. It's like in Malachi where, God says, bring in the full tithe. Why are you robbing me? Because you will see that I will stop the rodents from coming in. I will stop, well, rodents just come in all the time. Yes, but God is even sovereign over that. So I think in the same way that these things came up within his house, there are ways that God could have intervened during those times. So it's not, David's not at fault for Absalom's actions, but God could have changed Absalom's actions had David not fallen.
But I don't think there's any record in the story of any of his children seeking forgiveness for what they did.
Nope. Well, we're going to see with the one son, he does kind of go to Solomon and say, sorry, I tried to get crowned before you, but that he ends up kind of reneging on that. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, and it's this balance of blessing versus, it's not David's fault in that sense, like he made his children do that. But there is the sense, like for instance, when Absalom is taking over and you're wondering, why is he just leaving Jerusalem? Because he's like, I deserve to be removed as king. I know what I've done. And if that's what God wants, I'm going to move out because if I'm not going to take my own son's life to preserve my kingdom that I may have deserved to lose. So he was able to back away and let God do what he was going to do. Now God ended up affirming him and showing that his son was in the wrong. But yeah, I'm going to get going because otherwise we're not going to finish the lesson tonight. But that's a very good point. So the census with Israel is the other thing that he has as a condemned deed, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So the troubles that come with his family, his son ends up seeking the throne. So the history with this is Amnon, David's oldest son. He was madly in love with his half-sister, who was Absalom's full sister. And he ends up coming up with this scheme to be able to have her in bed. And so, interestingly, as a side note, the cousin of Amnon, who convinces him to do this little trickery to get Tamar there, is also the same one that later on is the one that assures David, don't worry, he didn't, Absalom did not kill all of your sons; he just killed the one. So the perpetrator ends up being the reporter. But one side note as well with this. This is where in the Greek version of Scripture it says that Amnon agape'd Tamar, which is one of the reasons why agape shouldn't always be just thought of automatically as unconditional love, because this was not unconditional love. The very moment that he has his way with Tamar, he then is disgusted with her, whereas all that Tamar was saying is, look, if this is what you want, just ask and I'll be given as a wife. And he was not willing to wait, and he did this. So Absalom, pretty calculated guy. He says nothing, good or bad. Seems to not react. And 2 years later, suddenly really wants to invite Amnon to the sheep shearing party, and he ends up having him killed. And then Absalom flees to Geshur, where his grandparents are, he is eventually brought back, but he's not fully reconciled with David. So then later on, so Amnon had fled to Geshur, but when he comes back, he starts to try to curry favor with the people by standing at the gate and like, oh, did you want to talk to the king? He's too busy. He won't listen to you. Talk to me. I'll take care of this for you. It sounds like stuff that sometimes happens in churches as well. But you have this whole thing of trying to curry the favor of the people, undermine the leadership of David, take stuff like that away. And he's supported by Ahithophel and Amasa. And so these are counselors of David. And so there are people that really like Absalom and would want him to be king. In fact, a good number of them. He was said to be very tall and extremely handsome. And of course, he had very long hair, which added to his demise. So he went to Hebron with the supporters to be declared king. And when David hears of this, he flees to Mahanaim, which was the capital that Saul had and the northern tribes of Israel had for years on the other side of the river. Absalom has his forces go out to meet David's in the hill country of Ephraim after he goes to Jerusalem. And they go out and meet in the hill country. Now, Absalom, during this time, in order to shame David, actually follows the advice of Ahithophel, who David, asked God to confuse that advice, and he sleeps with David's concubines on top of the palace publicly, which is specifically mentioned in the punishment for what happened with Bathsheba. He said, you did this privately. This will be done with your wives publicly. And then while they're having the battle in the hill country of Ephraim with David back at Mahanaim, you have Absalom being killed contrary to David's orders, and it's Joab that does the deed. So this is another one to stack up against Joab. And the way he is killed is he's riding through the forest and his hair gets caught in the tree branches and he hangs by his hair. And then and he's found completely alive, stuck like that. And Joab, instead of helping him down and taking him captive, drives a spear through him while he hung there. So then David is reestablished as king of Judah and Israel, though there is a short rebellion from a man named Sheba. He was from Saul's tribe. And tries to lead a revolt, but that's taken care of fairly swiftly. So then Adonijah, one of the next sons in line, he seeks to take the throne, probably about 2 years after Absalom. He does similar actions to Absalom, trying to curry everybody's favor. He's supported by Abiathar, the priest, and Joab, the commander of David's forces. These are two very powerful people, but they are two very powerful people who have fallen out of favor. Joab, having killed Absalom against David's orders, is now big time in the doghouse, and Abiathar is realizing Zadok is becoming the more prominent priest, so that probably explains their support. And then you have David, who is supported by Zadok, Benaiah, the commander of the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and Nathan the prophet. and David's mighty men, they are still loyal to David. Now, what's happening here is not really Adonijah trying to take the throne from David as much as to take it from Solomon. How much it was known that it was supposed to go to Solomon, David says it was to Bathsheba that I promised you this. Well, how long ago he promised that? Whether the prophet spoke when he named Solomon. Solomon was the son of Bathsheba after the other one that died, and that son was named. They named him Solomon, but the prophet Nathan called him Jedediah, which is beloved of God. And so it was that when it was kind of predicted that he would be the one that reigned. David had not set him up officially as the heir, it seems, from the way everything plays out, but it might be because Solomon was actually rather young at this time. And so what happens is Adonijah sets up a coronation at the southern end of the city of David, and without David's blessing, David at this point is quite old. I mean, he's going to, if I remember correctly, he's hearing this from his bed because he's not up and around as much. And so he was probably, Adonijah was probably trying to make happen what he felt was necessary and healthy and good. However, Solomon was the one who was chosen, and so David, as we said, had made a promise to Bathsheba, and we talked about the rest of this, but Solomon is not invited to Adonijah's anointing, even though he was a younger prince, which probably hints at the fact that it was known that he wasn't, that he was the one that should have been anointed. Supported by Nathan, Zadok, and David's mighty men, which was a big thing for Solomon. And as I said, he was quite young. So Adonijah's actions basically moved David to declare Solomon as the heir. So it's finally made public, and Solomon becomes king. Adonijah submits to Solomon at first. So when you see here with Solomon's kids, you have the sons that were born to him while he was in Hebron. And so Amnon was the one who's killed by Absalom. So Amnon was the oldest. Gilead, we hear almost nothing about. Absalom is the one then that tries to take over. He ends up being killed. And so Shephatiah, we don't hear anything about, or Ithream. But Adonijah, who was kind of the next one in line, he ends up making a play for the throne at the same time as Solomon, who was the son of Bathsheba. So he would have been a good deal older than Solomon as well. So when Solomon comes in, when you get into the very beginning of, I'm trying to think, are we at, I don't know if we're getting in the beginning of Kings at this point or not. But Solomon is establishing his throne. You have Adonijah, after making a play for the throne and then not doing it and submitting to Solomon, he then requests permission to marry Abishag, David's final concubine. This was the young woman that was caring for David in his old age. And it's said that she was there to keep him warm at night. They didn't have electric blankets, I guess. I don't know. But basically, when Adonijah does this, it is seen as a play for the throne. And Adonijah goes to Bathsheba and asks Bathsheba permission. And then Solomon is upset with Bathsheba, saying, don't you see that this is a play for the throne? And so he has Adonijah executed because of that. Abiathar, the priest, Solomon says he deserves death, but his sharing in David's suffering won him his life. And so he's banished from his hometown and removed from the priesthood. So for having gone against him and gone against David's wishes and such over the different years, he says this. Now, Abiathar being removed from the priesthood is the final fulfillment of Eli having no descendants that are serving the Lord. And then Joab, David basically instructs Solomon to not let him go to the grave in peace. Joab knows this the very moment, and he was supporting the other person for the throne. So he flees to the tabernacle and pleads for mercy, holding the horns of the altar. Interestingly, prior to this time through, it didn't dawn on me that the tabernacle wouldn't have been in Jerusalem at this point. It would have been probably over at Gibeon still. So basically, Solomon has him executed at that time for killing Abner and Amasa, not just for supporting Adonijah. Now, Shimei was a man who, when David was fleeing from Absalom, he stood and he cursed David and threw things at him, and David's men wanted to put him to death. Shimei was from the house of Saul and saw David as a shedder of blood and so on and so forth. And David's men wanted to kill Shimei, but David said, no, maybe this is God's will. When he came back through after Absalom had been killed, Shimei came out and apologized, but his men still wanted to kill him. But David had mercy on him. So when then Solomon came to power, David says, Solomon, you're wise. You'll know how to handle Shimei, but just watch out for him. So what Solomon says to Shimei is basically, you have to stay in Jerusalem with me, and the day you go out of Jerusalem, you'll forfeit your life. Well, he lost 2 donkeys, interestingly, similar to Saul, and he goes out to find his 2 donkeys and forfeits his life. And Shimei ends up paying the price for what he had said against David in that time. So the summary of all this is that David's character, he faithfully trusted the Lord and sought to follow him. He humbled himself before God in the good circumstances and bad when he was being confronted. He showed great mercy towards others and patience. So Saul, Joab, Amnon, Absalom, Mephibosheth, Shimei, you see his heart was a merciful heart. And then you might say he was too merciful in some of these. The evaluation is the greatest king in Israel's history. Now that is because every other king becomes measured by him. There actually are a couple other kings that really seek the Lord as well. But there is one that excels David in actual righteousness. Do you guys know which one that is?
Josiah, maybe?
Yep, Josiah. And so we're going to get to that, and you'll see how zealous Josiah was. And that's one of the reasons had we had a boy, which we did not, I would have probably picked Josiah John for their name. Josiah because of Josiah the king, John because it's my dad's name, my father-in-law's name, my brother's middle name, my brother's son's name, my grandpa's dad's name. Yeah, you got the idea. And then the other thing is God's love for David prevented the destruction of Judah in 2 Kings 9:19. You'll see that it's God remembers David, and when it says that his cursing goes to the 3rd or 4th generation, but his love extends to the 1,000th. You see this. You see this being played out. David's love for God, as imperfect as it was, gives God a great amount of mercy towards Israel as it falls away. And then you stop and you see how, here's David and the way he's acting towards Absalom and these other men who are failing. You see that patience and that in other words, he doesn't enjoy punishing. He doesn't enjoy enacting justice. And that may even be some of the way in which he was after God's own heart, where God, we almost push him to discipline. We push him to justice because his heart is more towards mercy and grace. And then we see that David, with his faithfulness, becomes the chosen line for the Messiah. And that's why Jesus then becomes the son of David. So we made it through 2 lessons. It's 8 o'clock, and we will see you next week. And I'm done talking for the day.